Hello everyone. Now those of you who follow the Hop Edition podcast already will probably know that I'm not a huge enthusiast when it comes to Kveik yeast, especially when it involves lager, but we're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. This video is about trying out Voss Kveik, which is probably the most widely available commercial version of Kveik yeast. So there's lots of different versions of Kveik. Those of you that know about it will know that Kveik itself just means yeast in Norwegian, I believe, and all the different regions have particular strains or even different brewers or farmhouses that they originate from. Anyway, Voss is the one that most people can get their hands on, and it is now available in dried format from a lot of places, including from Mangrove Jack's, which was the particular version that I was using in this beer. What I wanted to do was try it out, or what I wanted to do in a few videos actually, is try it out in different styles and see how it gets on and see if maybe the thoughts that I've got about it at the moment can be changed a little bit by basically finding beers that it's well suited to and that will get me good results. So today, can you Kveik it? American IPA, will it brew a good beer? Let's get into it and find out. So for this beer, I wanted to go for a fairly kind of traditional West Coast IPA type recipe, more of a sort of old school American IPA. And I'll put the full link to the Brewfather file in the description, so you can get the full details for this, obviously via that link. The batch size was 23 litres and working on a brew house efficiency of 72%. I was aiming for about 6.8% ABV with a 1065 original gravity, finishing down at 1013. The grist to achieve that was 5.75 kilograms of Pilsner malt, 680 grams of Munich malt, and 260 grams of Caragold. So not a huge amount of caramel in there, but one of the kind of signatures, I think, of West Coast IPAs is there usually is some kind of caramel or crystal malt involved in the grist in some way. This is probably a bit lighter than what you'll see in some of the older recipes or older style recipes for kind of commercial versions of that type of beer. Looking at the hop schedule, for a traditional kind of West Coast, you want a fairly heavy amount of bittering in there, and you're usually looking for a bitterness to gravity ratio of, or Bugu ratio of, somewhere around probably 0.9 to 1 would be good. And this one is actually a little bit higher than that even, so it's up at 1.07. So it should be fairly firm bitterness and definitely a calling card for West Coast sort of style IPAs. To get that with the hopping schedule, I've gone for 18 grams of Columbus at 60 minutes. We've got hopping kind of all the way through the boil rather than, you know, mainly at the end or in the whirlpool, as you'll see on a lot of modern IPAs nowadays. So we've got 20 grams of Centennial, again, classic kind of C hops there as well in the hop schedule. That's at 30 minutes. I've then got some Artenum in at 10 minutes in the boil with another 10 grams of Centennial. So 10 grams each of Artenum and Centennial at 10 minutes. Artenum is another real kind of classic IPA hop for this kind of style. And then in the whirlpool, we've got some Citra, 35 grams. Whirlpooling was done at 80 degrees for 20 minutes. 35 grams of Simcoe as well, and another 20 grams of Artenum. So those were the whirlpool hops. In the dry hop, I went with the same combination, but mainly Simcoe. So 60 grams Simcoe, 30 grams of Citra, and 20 grams of Artenum. So that's the hopping schedule. Quick mention of the water, because this is always quite important for differentiating kind of a West Coast or traditional American IPA from the more modern kind of hazy varieties and so on. All about the water profile, which is going to be high sulfate. So for this one, I was aiming for a profile of about 200 sulfate to 50 chloride. And in order to get that, using RO as a starting point, I added 3.6 grams of calcium chloride, 5.9 grams of Epsom salts, and 8.3 grams of gypsum. Also a little bit of phosphoric acid in the mash just to bring the pH down as well. So you also want to keep your pH under control, and ideally around about 5.2 to 5.4 in order to get a nice crisp finish as well. and avoid any issues with astringency from a high pH in the mash. Speaking of mash, with the mash temperature, normally you'd want to go fairly low with your mash temp to make sure that the beer dries out, so a nice dry finish, which is something which will also come from the high sulfate ratio, will be helped by a lower mash temperature in order to make a really nice fermentable wort. However, with Kveik yeast, particularly Voss, is really, really attenuative, and it will eat through a lot of the longer chain sugars anyway. So I actually went for a slightly higher mash temperature on this to make sure that it didn't go too crazy and dry it right out further than I wanted. So in order to keep the ABV under control as well, I went for a 68-degree mash temperature. As I mentioned at the start, this was fermented out with Mangrove Jack's M12 yeast, which is labelled as having 82% attenuation, but it can go a lot higher than that, so bear that in mind. Now, one of the other things about Voss yeast, and one of the things that a lot of people love about it, is the fact that you can ferment it at really high temperatures, and it will ferment beers out really quickly as well. So a lot of people who really like using these yeast is partly because of the quick turnaround that you can get with it, and for some people also the fact that you don't have to worry about temperature control as such. Although in a way, if you want to actually have it fermenting at those really high temperatures, you kind of need temperature control, obviously in the UK especially, most of the time, except for a few weeks over this summer anyway, in order to get your fermentation temperature up that high and actually hold it there. So I did go for a fairly high temperature, not at the top end of the range, but I think it was around about 30, 32 degrees, something like that. But that's probably in the brew footage, which I haven't looked back at just yet. So that's the recipe. Like I said, there's a link in the description. Go and check that out if you want to have a go at brewing this yourself. Let's have a look at some brew footage and then get onto the beer. So there we have the finished product. This has been at the keg for quite a while now. I've actually left this a bit longer than I normally would for the videos. One of the reasons for that is it has had a kind of persistent haze to it. Not really like opaque or muddy looking, but just didn't quite get that crystal clear clarity, which I kind of like as one of the sort of signatures of a West Coast IPA, is a nice bit of clarity on it. It didn't ever really quite get there. This is as good as it's been. And we're, yeah, like I said, we're probably a couple of months into having this in the keg at least. The Kveik yeast is really flocculent. It drops out initially quite quick, but for me, or at least with this Mangrove Jack's version of it, although it drops quite quickly, there's then a sort of persistent haze that just lingers around for a bit. That might just be me, I don't know. Let me know in the comments if anyone's had similar experiences to that. So colour-wise, it's quite a kind of deep honey kind of amber colour, which, again, the colour was a little bit surprising to me. It's slightly darker maybe than what I was expecting, certainly based on the recipe as well, which said it would be probably a bit below the style parameters for American IPA at just under 9 EBC. To me, that looks a little bit darker than that. So I don't know why that is. Perhaps some of the ingredients in the grist that I've used are a little bit darker than the numbers I've put in there, because it's not the exact same maltsters that I've put in and things like that. But anyway, it still looks good in the glass. I do like the look of the beer. It's got a nice little cap on the top there. And let's start having a little snifter of it. Oh, just to mention as well, as far as the actual brewing of it went, pretty much the numbers were bang on. I was, I think, 1 point over on the original gravity, and the final gravity did actually finish a couple of points lower as well. So what I was saying about the mash temperature for Voss or Kveik yeast generally, yeah, bear that in mind, because even at 68, it's still attenuated over the expected value, and that ended up giving me a 7% beer rather than 6.8% beer, which is okay. I wasn't too worried about that, but yeah, I think you do need relatively high mash temperatures with Voss Kveik just to keep it under control. So, like I said, back to the beer. Now, the aroma is really good, I've got to say. So it's proper kind of sticky, citrus rind, piney, loads of that West Coast goodness that just makes you want to dive in for a sip. It's not obviously as pungent as some of the IPAs that you'll see nowadays with much higher kind of hopping rates, particularly in the dry hop, but it's got really good hop presence. And yeah, just smells very appealing. So let's go in for a taster. There's a good firm bitterness on here. The bitterness is there. Definitely resiny, piney, kind of orange, almost like a syrupy orange, grapefruit kind of flavour there. I think you're getting quite a bit of dankness from some of those traditional C hops. I think the notes of orange are perhaps amplified a bit by the Voss yeast, which is known for presenting some kind of orange type esters from the flavour profile as well. It's definitely giving it that nice dry finish as well, so it's quite crisp, dry kind of mouthfeel. Finishes on the bitterness, which makes you immediately want to drink more. I mean, for me, it definitely ticks most of the boxes as far as the West Coast flavour profile. And I would have to say that as far as using Voss in this sort of style, it can definitely work, for sure. This has produced a flavour profile to me that is pretty accurate as far as the style guidelines go and as far as what you'd expect. Am I 100% happy with it? No. Now, I know I'm going to get probably some stick from especially my podcast companions about this, but it's not just because I'm not that keen on Kveik yeast generally. But I've got to say, I think if I was going to rebrew this beer, probably one of the first things I would try differently would be putting a different yeast in it. And for me, the reason for that would be I'd probably want to have a cleaner, more traditional kind of West Coast ale yeast, like a Chico or even like a dry English ale yeast, that would give you the attenuation, but just maybe not as much as far as the esters go. Now, the orange esters from Voss can definitely contribute in a beer like this, because West Coast IPAs are all about kind of citrus flavours and things like that. And it definitely does, I think, bring something that kind of marries up with the hops quite well. But at the same time, I always get kind of like a slightly earthy note from the brews that I've done with Kveik yeast generally. And to me, the orange flavour in this is a little bit, I don't want to say sour, but there's almost like a sort of sharp note to it that I'm not totally keen on. So for me, yeah, it just slightly muddies the flavors in this beer. It could have a slightly cleaner, kind of crisper flavor to it if perhaps you used a different yeast in there. So some people would love the flavor of this beer and would think it was great. I think maybe for me, I just don't get on with some of those extra flavor characteristics that come from Voss. Now, you could try altering the fermentation schedule for that in order to try and get it to come out a little bit cleaner. So I know that you can obviously drop the fermentation down a bit more, bring it more into the normal ale temperature range, maybe put it under more pressure as well, and you can pull out those esters a little bit. But yeah, I think if I did it again, I'd use some Chico or Bry 97 is a dry yeast that I use quite a lot for these type of beers, and I'd probably enjoy it more, to be honest. So can you quike it? Yes. Would I quike it? Not usually, to be honest. So we'll end it on that. Cheers, guys.
I'm the dude. So that's what you call me, you know? That or his dudeness or duder or, you know, El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.